So to start with, I think it's really important to give a brief introduction to North Staffordshire's rise and subsequent downturn as a global centre of ceramic production. So, a tile made at the now former Johnson's tile factory in Stoke-on-Trent took less than 30 minutes from raw material to fired end packaged product. 30 minutes. With not one human hand touching the tiles. Incredible. Back in 1974, 5,000 members of staff at Johnson's were employed to produce 2 million square metres of tiles per year. But prior to outsourcing its production in April in 2023, the plant employed around 120 staff, producing more than 3 million tiles per week. So in the tableware sector, companies who've sustained profits and driven growth have continued to invest in advanced automation to increase output. The volume of ceramics being made in North Staffordshire, as claimed, is higher than ever before. But whilst these advancements have massively reduced lead time and labour-intensive manufacturing, much industrial craft knowledge that once fashioned material objects in certain ways is in danger of disappearing. Through the recovery and analysis of archives, obsolete technologies, and living testimony, my work raises questions surrounding the value of contemporary relevance of intergenerational skill cultivated by instruction. And it considers how these can be safeguarded and regenerated into new modes of expression. So in terms of geography, Stoke is situated midway between Manchester and Birmingham. It's usually somewhere you drive past en route to either of those towns. It's a linear conurbation stretching for 12 miles through North Staffordshire that consists of 6 separate towns which have been famed for their industrial scale pottery manufacturing since the 18th century and has shaped the economic life and physical landscape of the region. Alongside pioneers of the Industrial Revolution such as Josiah Wedgwood and Spode, the Staffordshire potteries in the late 19th century comprised of hundreds of relatively small factories with more than 2,000 kilns firing millions of products a year. Perhaps the most important development was that a local workforce was becoming increasingly skill specialised through divisions of labour, a process that was to result in the integration of a population into an industrial economy led by the manufacture of pottery. By 1938, just over half the workforce of Stoke-on-Trent worked in pottery factories, with employment peaking in 1948 to an estimated 79,000 people. To this day, Stoke-on-Trent continues to be affectionately known as the Potteries. It's one of the few British cities with a distinctive regional identity that remains synonymous with a particular industry. Yet within the last 3 decades, escalating global competition has resulted in many North Staffordshire-based companies struggling to adapt or compete in both domestic and export markets. Rapid changes in lifestyle preferences, together with increased global competition from East Asia in the 1990s, forced many key factories to outsource high volume and low cost production to emerging economies where energy and direct labour costs were a fraction compared to those in North Staffordshire. This strategy, coupled with the advances of technology, proved highly detrimental to collective human skills and knowledge in Stoke-on-Trent, to what was then, in 1991, a 22,000 strong workforce. So from the late 1990s, commonplace headlines, together with the physical evidence of the effects of industrial decline, prompted the beginnings of what has become an ongoing process to archive industrial transitions occurring across the 6 towns. This wasn't motivated by nostalgia for past glory or a fetish for ruin porn, where the aestheticisation eclipses the trauma of social collapse. These images were very much driven by a compulsion to highlight the ensuing effects of globalisation from an insider's perspective, whose personal and social ties have been intertwined in the area's histories of ceramic manufacture. So both my maternal and paternal ancestry were employed in the North Staffordshire potteries, and from an early age, pottery terminology was brought about from my grandmother's lifelong employment in the ceramic industry, where she experienced many numerous skilled and semi-skilled jobs. In the centre of this slide is an image from 1859. It's a group of employees that had served a total of 54 and a half years service, with a family descendant, Moses Brownsword, on the left, seated in the middle of the group is Francis Wedgwood, Josiah Wedgwood's grandson. Henry Brownsword also worked at the Etruria factory, the Wedgwood Etruria factory, and worked closely with French painter Émile Lesaur during his period of employment at Wedgwood, and was respected enough to be immortalised here in this jasper plaque. So perhaps inevitable that I'd follow a similar path, and as the industry remained a dominant employer in the late 1980s, I was apprenticed at the age of 16 at the Wedgwood factory, where I trained primarily as a tableware modeller, predominantly with a group of male staff, about 25 highly skilled artisans. But this period was very much formative to my understanding of the wealth of human dexterity transmitted from generation to generation within each division of labour, and it's something I've continued to cite throughout my creative practice. So I first began to articulate this kind of displacement of transgenerational knowledge during an artist in residence period at the European Ceramic Work Centre in Holland in 1999. Here, visual and metaphoric appropriation of fragments of industrial archaeology that were observed from the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent were referenced really to draw attention to, I guess, regional ceramic production that was fast becoming a relic in contemporary kind of history. Yet following this period of the physical act of making things and from raw materials, I began to be drawn more to the symbolic presence of the discarded. So by 1800, Stoke-on-Trent paralleled China in terms of its ceramic output. But as the manufacture of ceramics was often a wasteful process, the residual material known as schraff was often used as landfill or hardcore for many of the 19th and early 20th century dwellings in the area. And from the site of the Edwardian property we bought in Stoke when I moved back from London, I began to do some DIY on the house, and digging down at the back of the house, unearthed all this pocket of schraff there on my own doorstep. So largely consisting of 18th, 19th century shards and various kiln technologies. So I was really interested in using this desire, I guess this charge of lost labour in a contemporary context. And it resulted in a series of object constructions that regenerated some of these remnants. And these referenced the endeavours of the past, which were all about achieving product perfection. And I was very influenced by these objects there on your right-hand side, known as wasters. These are kind of failed residues of production from about 1760. Yet this process of salvage and resurrection extended far beyond the realms of past history and really looked at kind of current history. So as a key element of my PhD research, I returned to the Wedgwood factory after 15 years of working there, following my apprenticeship. And I was very aware of this rapid displacement of craft knowledge in the ceramic industry. And it prompted my documentation of many of these traditional methods of production that were still in use. So it was filmed really at a very kind of intense period of economic restructuring in 2003. And I set out to do what was 3 months of field work, but ended up being there for 8 months, just me and my camcorder. So this period kind of captured, I guess, the voice of the maker. And I think with me being a former Wedgwood employee, I knew some of the people, so it was this kind of insider-outsider relationship. They accepted me and trusted me to kind of to do this research, even though it's a tricky period. So alongside the film documentation, I began to salvage much of this residual material from the processes, as this kind of ephemera made tangible many of the hidden human actions that accrued within each skill specialism. So with systems of product uniformity which came about through industrialization, standardization eradicated traces of its human touch that remained in manufacture, and any evidence of the hand was considered an imperfection. Yet these byproducts bore within their fabric physical imprints of the hand, which provided a direct connection to the repetitive skills passed down from generation to generation. So I was collecting clay turnings, rejected wares, and basically scavenging stuff out the bins when I was doing this filming, and then firing things to preserve this kind of momentary imprints of the worker's hand. And these kind of material remnants, what were rescued, constituted a piece which was called Salvage Series. And it was this spatial assemblage which was flanked by these 2 film loops, one that documented high craft skill against the demolition and dereliction of once prevalent sites of manufacture. But this piece of work wasn't a glorification of a distant past where lead poisoning and silicosis and poverty were endemic in the industry. It set out really to illuminate diverse knowledge and dexterity which is embedded in ceramic production and draw attention to its increased disappearance. So regional deindustrialization in recent decades has really brought about a general sense of detachment from the history and fabric of ceramic production in the area. And one opportunity back in the in 2009 led to a project which was about, I guess, exploring the kind of origins of industry and bringing it back into the public arena. So difficulties in securing regular supplies of Chinese porcelain when tea drinking had become highly fashionable in England around the 1670s led to these red stonewares being introduced from southern China via the East India Company, predominantly from Yixing. And these were imitated in Delft and later in England in the 1690s when 2 Dutch immigrants, John and David Ehlers, relocated to Bradwell Hall in North Staffordshire after locating a suitable seam of red clay that when fired was similar in colour to those produced at Yixing. So in the 1690s, the majority of British pottery was either wheel thrown or press moulded and glazed with lead oxide or salt. So the sophistication to production the Ehlers introduced into North Staffordshire were at that time unrivalled. As silversmiths, the Ehlers were familiar with the use of moulds for casting precious metals and are believed to have been the first to have transferred this knowledge to ceramics by pouring liquid clay into plaster moulds before either refining the surface of the cast with a horizontal lathe, which were both pioneering technologies that later revolutionized ceramic production. So to re-engage a contemporary audience with this largely forgotten but important aspect of the origins of British ceramic manufacture, I curated the project Marlhole for the 2009 British Ceramics Biennial, where the Ealers established their early workshop in Bradwell Wood, holds a very kind of personal resonance as I grew up in this region. And it's where I first encountered clay in its natural abundance. Today's sites of open cast excavations, known as marlholes, from where clays were once quarried for brick and tile production, remain prominent features which litter this landscape. So, to reactivate this historic seam of clay, known as a Etruria Marl, I invited 4 international artists to work over a 5-day period at Ibstock Bricks Gorsty Quarry, one of the UK's largest brickmaking quarries. And through this process of creative dislocation, the project brought about ways to interrogate and articulate clay through a range of ephemeral interventions. So these encounters were inevitably determined by a new set of unpredictable factors, the weather being one, the limitation of the materials in its various unprocessed states, alongside more self-inflicted measures, as each artist was deliberately denied their familiar tools and could only use implements gleaned from the immediate vicinity. So, after several days of relying on rudimentary methods to extract clay using shovels and buckets, artists were quick to commandeer the use of these earth movers from Ibstock, and they allowed an unforeseen volume of clay to be manoeuvred around the site. To the left there is Dutch artist Alexander Ingelfried, whose interactions with the site involved a bodily impact, knees becoming the tools to manipulate the plastic material in these apertures. And then there's Finnish artist Pekka Pekari, who took this lexicon of once commonplace terminology associated with the history of ceramic production in Stoke-on-Trent, and then randomly deposited these letters within a 25-metre square, serving as a poignant comment to the loss of a unique vernacular language of labour. So this exploration of site as a raw material was significant to a further project, which is Topographies of the Obsolete, and it was initiated with a partnership with Bergen Academy of Art and Design, and in collaboration with a colleague, Anne-Helene Midland, for the 2013 British Ceramics Biennial. So it involved a site-specific response to the former Spode factory, which had fallen into administration in 2008. And it was being repurposed via numerous cultural-led regeneration initiatives that were rebranding the city as world capital of ceramics. But yet within this regeneration agenda at place, local government and cultural organisations projected a more sanitised account of recent history, which circumvented the fallout of industrial change. So at its core, Topographies aim to challenge this politicised amnesia and seek a greater critical discourse in these transitions and their impact upon people, place and traditional knowledge. As Sherry Lincoln has observed, deindustrialisation has a half-life, and like radioactive waste, its effects remain long after the abandoned factory buildings have been torn down and workers have found new jobs. So throughout this 8-year project, 97 artists and cultural commentators from 13 countries explored a variety of perspectives concerning the industrial ruin, the globalised landscape of ceramics, and the artist as archaeologist. However, working in a city then ranked the 13th most economically deprived city in the country, participants from some of the wealthiest countries in Europe were confronted with the ethical dimensions of dealing with such a loaded space and site. So frequent questions surrounded the role of the artist working in an art space, such as, do artists destroy the archaeology of a site, or do they contribute another layer of production? Is the artist instrumental to the renewal of such places, or merely an apocalypse tourist who's cashing in on social misfortune? So there were many kind of paradoxes and dilemmas through this project, but one of its primary benefits was that some of the funding we got from the Norwegian Artistic Research Council supported local labour to restore previous derelict spaces for ongoing cultural use. And the funding also allowed me to hire and collaborate with a small group of China painters whose professions had been displaced by changing fashion and ceramic print technologies in a performative installation which was called National Treasure. So companies in Stoke that had survived the impact of global competition have in recent years turned to factory tourism, where authenticity and provenance are commodified through demonstrations performed by the artisan on display. In these situations, the reality of mass automation and outsourced production are often obscured by marketing strategies that heighten the cachet of the handmade. However, many high-end ceramic skills that were once the flagship of these renowned factories are economically unviable to accommodate today's rapid shifts in consumer trends. Recruited into the project was Anthony Challoner, one of Spode's former employees, who worked at the factory until its closure in 2008. And set to work in a post-industrial context, the performance of these skills served as a series of provocations where the spectator's gaze would oscillate between the mesmerising nuances of hand painting, common to the visitor centre experience, and the wreckage and disorder of the former Spode factory. Separated behind glass as they plied their skills, artisans were instructed to paint on the back of damaged and discarded plates that were found on site at the Spode factory, with imagery that parodied the 18th century's romanticisation of British ruins through ceramic painting. Though portraying picturesque decay was not the objective, the spaces within the foot of the plates, where the painter would traditionally sign their workmanship, were instead graced with images documenting the fallout of industrial change in Stoke-on-Trent. Each painter would occupy the space intermittently and work within their own time structures, dissolving conventional hierarchies between employer and employee. When not in attendance, the vacated spaces were illuminated, and together with the residues of labour arrested in a state of incompletion, only reinforced this idea of presence and absence in the work. However, with this outsourcing of people and their skill as a raw material, the ethical dimensions of the project remain paramount. Artisans were hired above their indicated rates of pay and fully credited as collaborators within the project. So again, National Treasure wasn't a nostalgic kind of repetition of the past, but it was a repositioning of the past in the present that served to negotiate the impact of social redundancy following the collapse of the factory. So the opportunity to perform National Treasure in South Korea, and a country that gives status to individuals with exceptional artistic ability as a means to preserve and nurture cultural heritage, provided a prestigious platform to warrant similar cultural attention to Stoke-on-Trent's endangered craft practices. In 2003, UNESCO implemented this convention to safeguard intangible cultural heritage, which helped to ensure crafts continued to be practiced within their communities, providing livelihoods to their makers and reflecting creativity and adaptation. In 2015, 127 countries had endorsed this convention, effectively making intangible heritage part of their cultural policy. However, the UK at that point in time was not one of them. So further attempts to re-evaluate the contemporary relevance of these intergenerational skills and how they can be, reimagined into new modes of expression formed the basis of a project which was called Reapprenticed. So as technology has substituted many of these traditional skills, such as china painting, copperplate engraving, there remains no system in place to secure the effective transfer of such knowledge. So to gain insights into the transmission and acquisition of these practices, I apprenticed myself to 3 former industry employees who are amongst the last of a generation of master practitioners in their respective fields. By reenacting these stages of formal apprenticeship through a process where the novice inhabits the non-linguistic embodied actions of the expert, I was able to access the internalized rules and operations within each craft. So each skill specialism was deconstructed to expose nuances of preparation, material and haptic knowledge, pace and repetition. So deliberately disrupting the predetermined aspects of these skills, such as halting stages of progress, which then arrested sequences of touch, enabled ephemeral gestures to be made tangible through both film and object. So this reactivation of memory through the transfer of haptic and material knowledge facilitated a detailed insight of know-how which the artisans often would take for granted. So my participation also helped the artisans recount a wealth of oral history which was kind of locked in to their memory really, such as the socialization into work and the impact of industrial change, which I think without the project would have been lost. So me working with this group of people and asking these questions and getting them to repeat what they did on the factory, and me kind of observing, filming, and then asking more silly questions, kind of opened up this dialogue and this discourse. But finding value in the memory in this knowledge has often led to a pejorative charge of nostalgia and a kind of eulogizing of a past that's out of sync with an ever-changing world. But I would argue that these first-hand recollections remain essential human narratives that can enrich our scope and understanding of industrial history. As the scholar Ray Cashman states, critical nostalgia acts as a powerful force for social reconnection without fixating on the loss or the impossibility of returning to the past. It can serve in many contexts to retrieve the past in support of building the future. So, having acquired a basic knowledge of each craft skill through this kind of pseudo-ethnographic approach, I repositioned myself as an apprentice to an instructor, redirecting the nuances of actions, materials and processes into new forms that were subsequently performed by each artisan. This is a piece of work in collaboration with the flower maker Rita Floyd. And in 2015, the Victoria and Albert Museum facilitated an opportunity for me to perform Reapprenticed in their Raphael Cartoons Gallery, which holds Raphael's full-scale designs for tapestries that were made for the low walls of the Sistine Chapel. So set against the backdrop of these masterpieces of Renaissance art, this space provided a perfect context for the public engagement with the performance of these marginalised factory skills that were re-choreographed under my instructions to emphasise sophistications of material and haptic knowledge. So by positioning fabricators of cultural commodities centre stage, These performances aim to challenge the museum's preservation of object embodiments of craft, rather than supporting conditions for the continuation and regeneration of such knowledge. And this reassembly of collective labour and skill formed the basis of another project, Factory, which was initially staged at the Ashmolean Museum in 2016, and then went to Incheon World Ceramics Centre in South Korea in 2017. So here, the Factory ceramic practices of two ex-industrial ceramic artisans from Stoke-on-Trent, again, China flower maker Rita Floyd and mould maker James Adams were positioned alongside 4 Korean master potters. And this subversion and recontextualising of procedural knowledge from both traditions sought to explore a shared language of haptic intelligences and question established hierarchies that were assigned to modes of cultural production. So by foregrounding living heritage via arts-led collaboration, Factory challenge notions that specialist knowledge becomes redundant once the support networks of the factory don't exist. It aimed to demonstrate that such knowledge can remain open to an active process of change, and that the holders of such knowledge are dynamic cultural mediators between the past and the present. China flower making remains one of the few methods of mass production that relies completely upon the dexterity of the hand. But with changing fashion, this industry has all but disappeared in Stoke-on-Trent. So Rita Floyd's performances provided an intimate space for the audience to witness the complex nuances of touch that are evident in her craft. Yet points of passive spectatorship were immediately disrupted by Rita's continual discarding of her manufacture upon this 6-metre production line, which was built in the gallery. And also in Korea, I had the opportunity to work with an intangible cultural asset, Kwan-Soo So, who was renowned for the continuation of many traditional forms of Korean ceramics, such as the moon jar. And through directing the collaboration, Kwan-Soo produced a series of moon jars that were halted in their partially formed state to retain their raw materiality and immediacy of touch. And ex-mold maker and modeller James Adams, who'd worked with me, took these casually assembled components into a lesser revered mode of production, mold making, instrumental to the histories of ceramic manufacture in North Staffordshire. The seams of the moon jar resonated with the seams of the mould, which standardisation through industrial production paradoxically removed any evidence of human touch. So this subtle blurring and integration of opposing hierarchies revealed how both tradition-bound systems conform to similar tactile mechanisms and explicit actions central to experiential knowledge. Following the closure of a key factory in Stoke-on-Trent, I was granted access to this abandoned site, and where there was this car park which was strewn of these discarded rubber moulds, which were originally used to create working plaster moulds for mass production. Again, hundreds and hundreds of these things just kind of thrown away in the car park. But these were interesting because they held within their fabric, they were marked by a particular point in time. As prior to the factory's closure, they were kind of defaced and kind of cut up to deter subsequent reproduction. You know, it was to get rid of the intellectual property of these objects, so no one else could reproduce these objects. So I'd salvaged some of these objects and then presented them in a formal taxonomy for this space in Korea, but also used them as performative objects. And they were reactivated by master mold maker Sinyin Cho and other Korean master artisans to expand this idea surrounding cultural transfer and how aesthetics, practices and technologies central to ceramic history travel through place and time. So once they were cast in porcelain, they were then passed down to another master carver who then applied traditional Korean motifs to these fragmentary reproductions, continuing this idea of Western romantic traditions of aesthetic decay, but also revealing this tension between value and perfection that's inherited through both traditions. So within these performances, Korean artisans had complete autonomy to impart their knowledge grounded within their own cultural context upon objects indicative of North Staffordshire's post-industrial situation. So factories' collaborative modes of investigation stimulated reciprocal discourse through the exchange of tacit and explicit knowledge. This process of reactivating obsolescence through non-commercialized production created a space where the holders of marginalized immaterial heritage could speak for themselves, in a cultural context where such embodiments of knowledge are revered, renewed and sustained for future generations. But coinciding with this factory project, the Heritage Craft Association in Britain published this Radcliffe Red List of Endangered Crafts in 2017, and it was the first research of its kind conducted in the UK. It highlights important aspects of the UK's collective intangible heritage to assess the current viability of traditional crafts and identify those which are most at risk of disappearing. But the industrial crafts, particularly those in relation to North Staffordshire and ceramic production, were not accounted for. So I was kind of a bit perturbed by this and contacted them. And to readdress this imbalance, I've been working with the HCA to ensure awareness is raised about this threatened practices within the ceramic industry. But safeguarding doesn't mean relegating these practices to the dogma of the past. So one of the aims of a research residency at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2017 was to explore ways in which traditional knowledge can be transmitted to new modes of expression and representation. So historic pattern books, which were held at the V&A and also at the Wedgwood Museum, record and convey know-how from factory production, became a primary influence. They're so visual, these things, these deconstructions of objects. As you can imagine, most people on a factory working circa 1850 were illiterate, so these things were kind of very visual, which talked about kind of the positioning of a cartouche on a pot or the way to paint something. They were kind of manuals of production, really. But within them, within this period of early Staffordshire, cultural borrowing and assimilation evident in chinoiserie designs were often idealized to align with Western taste and perpetuated stereotypes and diluted cultural motifs into decorative novelty for the mass market. So the exotic East was both fetishized and commercially exploited by Staffordshire potters way into the 19th century, an era tainted by opium conflicts and colonial pursuits. So in citing this complex history, I wanted to accentuate the slippage inherent in cultural reproduction by disrupting these representations, which are typical of Britain's industrial scale appropriation of imagery and artefacts from East Asia. So using objects I purchased online via auctions, eBay, that were similarly held in the V&A's collection, it allowed me to improvise with these historic objects and copy my own ceramic culture beyond curatorial restrictions. So these objects were rendered with varying degrees of skill compared to their East Asian influences and nuances of painting and print, unique to early Staffordshire ceramic production, were digitally extracted from their form using rudimentary scanning procedures, which disrupted the continuity of the copy. So these digital disruptions collectively constituted my own pattern book, which was subsequently activated by a master Spode engraver, Paul Holdway, whose father was the design director at Spode, so kind of, again, this passing on of knowledge. And I passed on this kind of glitchy reproduction of this 1830s mason's ironstone chinoiserie design, and then asked him to re-engrave this into a copper plate as a live performance at the V&A. So this act of reinscription from one medium to another activated the pattern book into function as an actual pattern book. So translating these elements that were themselves translations, Holdway made a feature of the blemish, drawing attention to this level of skill that underpinned industrial perfection. A microscopic camera was trained on Holdway's hands and fed to a live screen, amplifying the immediacy of digital imperfection and its remediation via the slow-paced tactile interactions of handwork. So these skilled practices that have evolved through hundreds of years of ceramic industrialization represent so much more than just the mastery and control of materials and processes. They've shaped the complex bonds, networks, and pride forged through collective labour, which remain integral to the identity of places such as Stoke-on-Trent. So through these projects that stimulate reciprocal discourse and sensory understanding, my re-navigation of living heritage practices remains a small contribution to ensure that endangered industrial crafts continue to be practiced for future posterity. This flips into tangible heritage, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about it. In 2019, a project called Externalising the Archive, which was again curated for the British Ceramics Biennial at the former Spode site, attempted to draw attention to heritage at risk. So Spode was one of the few ceramic manufacturers in Britain to have operated continuously for 230 years on its original site of production. So within 11 of its buildings, there remained over 70,000 moulds dating back from circa 1850, when the company had ceased trading, up to 2008 when the company had ceased trading. So this amazing archive, which has got no inventory, was still there on the site. And as the process, as the site is in the process currently in terms of regeneration and its buildings being repurposed, only a small percentage of this material was recommended for future retention. There was 2% of this material of the 70,000, which was earmarked for kind of preservation. So working in conjunction with the city archaeologist, a significant volume of these moulds dating from 2005 to 2008 were removed from the stores and installed in the external environment within Spode's former Jubilee kiln. And I'd reconstructed these objects to retain this kind of architectonic presence, which was observed in the former mould stores, mould environments. And so the moulds were left exposed to the elements as a deliberate provocation to encourage greater discourse surrounding their impending disposal, which no one knew about. So as predicted, the majority of the passing public's immediate response was of wanting to protect these things. What are all these moulds doing outside? Aren't they going to get stolen? And you know, it then kind of opens up this discourse. Yeah, well, they're destined for landfill anyway, you know. So what do we do about this material, which is part of our heritage? We can't reproduce from these things because the intellectual property is retained by another factory. They're just material byproducts, 70,000 of them. There's a bit of a dilemma. You've got the built heritage falling down around these objects. It threw out the questions again, really. So within the environment, I put 2 looped films, which were situated in the space, which reconnected dexterity, you know, manual dexterity with mold making, model making, together with a fragmentary piece of work, which reconfigured, I guess, the mechanics of the mold, because I wasn't allowed to reproduce the intellectual property. I was more interested in how the mould would function. So the spaces which were, I guess, marginalised spaces, the kind of foot of a mould or the natches within a mould or the outside of a mould, I was casting and then repositioning in this fragmentary bone china installation, which again was situated outside. So we also turned to digital technology in response to this disposal issue. So externalizing the archive piloted the use of photogrammetry and 3D scanning to create digital surrogates of a selection of these mold typologies and shapes as a means of preserving their design data. But raised the question again regarding whether the digital can be an effective substitute for the physical, which I don't believe it can, of the site and its materials. And also we scanned 4 of the former mould stores, which were transformed into an interactive tour, which sounds a bit gimmicky, using virtual reality, but it introduced this idea of heritage at risk to a passing public who couldn't access these spaces, but it allowed them to kind of experience the volume of this material. So since my engagement with the project, Stoke-on-Trent City Council more than doubled the scale of its retention strategy. I think it was 5%, but at least it was something. And it demonstrated how artistic intervention can influence government policy, local government policy, and constitute to the protection of an endangered post-industrial heritage. So again, more recently, my use of the digital tool as a means to navigate marginalised histories of place has increasingly become a point of fascination. In a project called Alchemy and Metamorphosis, shown at the Potteries Museum in 2021, the performance of industrial craft practices alongside modes of digital remediation emphasised the importance of supporting traditional knowledge alongside the advances of new technology. So 3D printed facsimiles of ceramic archetypes, which were central to the development of regional history and industry, were moulded in the exhibition space and reactivated by casting with historic clay body recipes, which were known to have induced failure when fired, rather than industrial methods of standardisation and perfection. These are Josiah Wedgwood's trials and I curated, I think there were 6 cases of them for the exhibition. And if you know the history of Wedgwood, is one of the straplines is that he strove for perfection. And he was amongst the first to document this knowledge through written form. So, you know, all this kind of early kind of empiricism, he found a way of recording it through these kind of recipe books. But he wrote all these things down in secret code to prevent industrial espionage. So the recipes were written in black and red ink, but there is I guess a Rosetta Stone at the Wedgwood Museum, which helps you to decipher what these recipes were. So yeah, historically, pre-science, he'd send us geologists all over Britain to gather mineral samples, and then through this process of kind of alchemy, you know, he was there roasting these raw materials together to kind of understand what they did. And he would often dismiss these kind of globular or blobby things which had failed in his eyes as kind of, you know, not meeting the mark. But I was really fascinated by these things which were everything about what he thought as failure. So I was kind of quick to go back to these recipes which were about failure, and then reactivate these recipes to then cast into these molds from these digital facsimiles. So reactivating failure again, because this process, you know, failure, without, you know, to achieve perfection, failure is so kind of instrumental to get there. And I use failure in inverted commas. It's a stage in the process. So again, the idea was to introduce, you know, the history of ceramics is always written about by those people like Wedgwood and who are kind of clever marketeers who are always successful. But the knowledge base is there in the beginning. Industrialisation in North Staffordshire occurred much earlier than what you think as the Industrial Revolution. There is organised labour, and there are marketplaces and skill division by 1715 in the region. So all this knowledge is kind of accrued, and then the likes of Wedgwood always kind of appropriate that kind of the success of this knowledge. So you'll always find that Spode successfully perfected underglazed blueprinting, or successfully perfected bone china. People were doing it beforehand. And Wedgwood's you know, innovation or invention of creamware, there was Enoch Booth in the 1740s who was creating creamware. So I was kind of interested in going back further with these kind of unknown artists and trying to celebrate them, really. So I'd curated this exhibition which was all about this kind of early history of production. And this piece here is a piece of proto-porcelain, which is known as Pomona ware, which no one really knows about because it never succeeded in terms of an end product. It was a kind of experimental porcelain where the body was largely crushed glass and other materials, which basically, when it was fired, it tore itself apart in the kiln. So this is from 1746. So I was kind of fascinated by the revisiting of these objects. And they were unearthed in, I think, the late 60s, 70s, when archaeology maybe was a bit more liberal. So the guy who kind of excavated them and found them, left them on the site, went for lunch and came back, and half of it had disappeared, you know. So again, this idea of, I guess, exploring the unrealized potentials of industrial history was echoed in another project which was called Obsolescence and Renewal. And I guess it examined the histories of reproduction through a cross-disciplinary lens and a range of cultural perspectives. So it also considered skeuomorphism in ceramics, you know, drawing upon historic objects that typify technological advances in ceramic industrialization that simulated design features in other materials, you know, that kind of origins of, I guess, pots. You can kind of look back at basketware and see how some pots were kind of imitated the surface of a basket or metalwork. You know, it's this amazing crossover between other material knowledge. So this was a white stoneware sauceboat from about 1750, model and mould, which within it is a kind of this mishmash of stylistic kind of design features, you know, basketware, kind of rococo swags, the idea of whiteness coming from Chinese porcelain. Again, this kind of assembly of all these things, which kind of spoke about innovation in industrial perfection. So I'd use the design data from scanning some of these objects and you know, disrupted them further, turned these objects into images, and began to kind of use the slow-fi method of multipass printing. So these images would kind of obliterate themselves. I then also looked at this kind of range of chinoiserie from about 1810 from factories, again from masons and Newhall porcelain, and then stripped away the surfaces of these objects and transformed them into a series of digital tapestries, again drawing a lens to, again, Britain's commercial exploitation of East Asian cultural symbolism in the 18th and 19th century. So I was scanning these things, reworking them, superimposing them to erase and flatten out borrowed motifs as a means to kind of undermine modes of historic cultural representation. And also this idea of transferring knowledge from my background, ceramics, to other materials and processes, it's kind of interesting for me. So the idea of working with ceramics more as a subject, other than its materiality, was something which kind of I've continued to pursue, really. So the digital print, and people often say, are they ceramic? And I'll say, no, they're resin. And then they'll go, oh, yeah. And I'm kind of really interested in material hierarchies and values, what people place on things. So the digital for me is a sketchbook, really, and I guess the immediacy of 3D printing allows me to kind of think about some of these objects in different ways. But these are, again, all pre-industrial kind of archaeology from about 1715 to 1740, just collided with each other to make these, I guess, glitchy three-dimensional objects, which look at the copy and this idea of the copy without an original. And I'm going to shut up now because I'm probably way over time. Or am I bang on time?
Yes, go ahead. Yep.
Is that okay? I'm done anyway, so thanks for listening.